As filmmakers, we are forever trying to learn new things to help us get better and improve at our craft. But often I find when I'm looking for tips and things that will help me in my filmmaking journey, I find myself often hearing the same ones. So I thought for today's video, I'm going to speak to you guys about 5 filmmaking hacks that you probably haven't heard before. Today's video is sponsored by Zyro. Zyro is an online website builder that is really easy to use and super affordable. If you guys are looking for a website, check out the link in the description. Otherwise, use code Sean for 30% off your plans, but more on that later. The first hack that I want to talk to you guys about is about your frame rate. And now I'm sure a lot of you guys know that if you want to just film normal footage, you should be filming in 24 frames per second. And if you want to shoot any slow motion and nice smooth B-roll, you need to shoot at higher frame rates like 60 frames per second or even more so 120 frames per second. But what happens when you don't have those options available to you? Maybe your camera only allows you to shoot in lower frame rates, or you have those higher frame rates, but you want to shoot in a higher resolution, something like 4K, and when shooting in 4K, your camera only allows you to shoot in something like 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second. Well, here's where this hack comes in. If you only have something like 30 frames per second available to you, as we know, the most cinematic frame rate is going to be 24 frames in our final project. And what we can do is capture our footage in that 30 frames per second. Later on in post, we can slow our footage down to that 24 frames per second, and it's subtle, but it makes it just a little bit more smooth. It takes out some of those micro jitters if you were shooting anything handheld, and it ends up giving a really nice result. So the next time you guys find yourself wanting to shoot some cinematic B-roll and you need that higher resolution, but you still want it to look kind of nice and smooth, give this one a go. It really has a cool effect and definitely something that you guys should have in your arsenal as a filmmaker. The next one I want to talk to you guys is about your aperture. Now, again, I'm sure a lot of you guys know that if you want that blurry background, that shallow depth of field that creates such a nice cinematic look, you need to open that aperture to as wide as you can and have as low of an f-stop as possible. But here is another interesting trick that you guys can try using your aperture. You will notice when you have a wide aperture and you're getting that blurry background, any light sources or anything like that are going to be blurred out in a kind of round or ovular shape. But here's something really interesting to try. Once you have an f-stop of something that is around f10 or higher, you will notice that any light sources or lens flares all of a sudden won't have those ovular shapes anymore. They will actually turn into these really interesting starburst effects where those light sources are flaring out with all of these different lines and like a star effect. It's a really cool thing to play around with, keeping in mind that you won't be able to achieve that blurred out background when you're doing this, and you're also going to need quite a bright location because you're going to be closing that aperture down so much that you're not going to be letting that much light into your sensor. Give this one a go, see if you can create those star flares. It creates a very interesting look and definitely something that is fun for you guys to play around with. If you guys have watched any hacks and tips videos, I am sure that you have heard of ND filters, sunglasses for your camera. I've even made a bunch of videos on them myself, and they are a super useful thing to have, but I know that a lot of you guys say you don't have money for expensive ND filters, or maybe you're shooting on something that doesn't allow you to attach an ND filter, maybe something like a cell phone. Here is where this tip is gonna come into play. So if you guys are unsure why we actually use these ND filters, it's to achieve the correct amount of motion blur in the videos that we shoot. It's important for a realistic look that when things are moving, you can see that they have a certain amount of motion blur, and if your shutter speed is too high, it creates a very choppy look and it's much less desirable than that nice smooth motion blur that we're after. Here's the thing. If you guys don't have those ND filters, maybe you just can't use it in that particular situation. Maybe you're even just too lazy to deal with swapping out those ND filters depending on the different light scenarios. Basically, you can apply artificial motion blur in post in your editing software. A lot of editing software has this built in. Otherwise, you can get plugins like Real Smart Motion Blur that you can apply after the fact. And no matter what shutter speed you guys were shooting at, and no matter how choppy your footage originally looked, once you apply these motion blur effects, it looks very, very similar to the real thing. So if you guys are ever in that situation, maybe it's a drone shot that you guys captured in direct sunlight and you had to crank that shutter speed to something like 1/2000, well, then try this. I do advise that maybe if you guys can get your hands on ND filters, it might be a better idea to do it in camera. It's never really a good idea to try and fix it in post, but I thought I would share this with you as it is an option and it might save you when you find yourself in a little bit of trouble. This next technique is one of my favorite by far, and that is shooting backlit and putting your light source behind your subject. Now, often as beginners and people that are just starting to get into filmmaking and photography, it is often assumed that you should have the light coming from behind camera shining directly onto whatever it is that you're shooting. And although this is often the case, you can get some really interesting outcomes by all of a sudden switching that up, whether that's shooting into the sun when it's a little bit lower in the sky and putting your model in front of the sun, having your camera shooting directly into that light. It creates a very interesting look and you guys can experiment with this and get some awesome outcomes. Some of my favorite things about this are you get some really interesting lens flares and you get those sunbursts coming out from behind your subject, those kind of light burst effects. Some of the other things is if you pull it off right, you can get a really nice golden light, otherwise known as a hair light behind your subject, really making them pop and stand out from the background. Even if it's quite a busy background, you can often get that nice golden light around them, separating them and allowing them to really pop in that image. So this is something that I really encourage you guys to try. I find myself shooting into the light probably more often than shooting with the light behind me. Another time I really like to utilize this tip is when you are shooting in more of a harsh light. Maybe the sun is still quite high in the sky, and instead of having that harsh light come directly onto your model's face or anything that you're shooting, you can turn them around, have them in shade, and you can have the sun behind them. I actually created a whole video on shooting in harsh light, and if you guys want to go and check that out, it is going to be linked up over here. As content creators in today's world, you need somewhere for all of your awesome work to live and a place that you can showcase it to the world. That's where today's sponsor is going to come into play, Zyro. Zyro is an online website builder that is super easy to use and really, really affordable. Zyro is the easiest way for you guys to build a website, whether it's personal or professional. Maybe you want a portfolio or even an online store. Their drag and drop way of building websites and the features make it so easy to put something together that looks super professional. You could literally sign up and start building a website this afternoon and be done by the end of the day and have an amazing professional website for yourself. One of my favorite things about Zyro is you can manage multiple marketplaces at once, so you can sell on places like Amazon, Facebook, or Instagram. If you guys are content creators and you are looking for a website, check out the link in my description. You can use the code Sean and you can get 30% off of your plan. The last thing that I want to talk to you guys about is using different focal lengths in different specific scenarios to get really interesting outcomes. And this is kind of what I'm talking about. Using really wide lenses has a very different effect than using a much more zoomed in lens, even if your frame is framed up in the same way. You'll notice if you have a really wide lens and you get a really close up of somebody's face, if I came all the way up into this lens, it's going to be quite distorted, my face is going to be long, and it's not going to be a very pleasing look for someone's face. Likewise, if you guys are trying to shoot something like a landscape and you are on a very long lens, you are of course not going to be able to get the image that you guys are after. The fun thing about this is once you guys get the hang of which lenses perform the best in which scenarios, you can start to create some really interesting looking images. For instance, if you guys throw on a really long lens and you move that lens, maybe you track someone running through a forest, for example, it's going to make it look really, really fast because the lens is going to be moving so quickly that everything's going to be rushing past that frame. Whereas if you had a really wide lens quite close to that person running through the forest and you turned with them, it wouldn't be very fast, it would be quite slow and it wouldn't have the same effect. Something on the opposite scale might be having a really, really wide lens, but getting really close up into that action and creating a really immersive experience for the viewer. Maybe someone is skateboarding and you can get really low, very close with that wide lens, something you wouldn't be able to do if you guys were on a much longer lens. Something else that you need to look out for with different focal lengths is you can see in this little demonstration that I have here, with the same scene framed up in the same way, if we're all the way zoomed out at 17 millimeters on a full frame sensor, you can notice that we can see a lot of our background and our subject, being Hannah, is in the middle there. But as we zoom in and as our focal length gets closer and closer and closer, that background compresses, and even though Hannah is the same size in that frame, the whole background looks like it's much closer to her, and it also gets much, much bigger, meaning you can see a lot less of it. The other thing you will notice is the face gets squished and more compressed down like this as you get closer in, and as it goes wide again, it gets distorted and warped out longer and ends up looking quite unnatural. For something like portraits, a lot of people will agree that the best focal lengths are somewhere between 35 millimeters and 85 millimeters to get the most realistic outcome for that person's face. You guys can experiment with this as much as you want, and you can get really interesting outcomes by maybe bending some of these guidelines. So don't feel that you have to stick to these exact focal lengths. They are rather just something that you guys should be aware of. That is gonna be it for this video, guys. I hope that these tips were new to you and that you at least hadn't heard all of them. Remember that if you guys are looking for a super easy and affordable website builder, check out Zyro. They're going to be linked down in the description. Otherwise, use my code Sean for 30% off of your plan. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in next week's video.